And why would this particular message be so important to convey? I believe it is because Esther is about to ask for her life, for the life of her people. Hi YouTube, and welcome back to my channel. Thank you so much for joining me here today on Lily of the Field to study Esther. Sorry that this video is quite late. I usually try to do 2 a week, but this was quite a difficult topic for me to study. So last week I talked about how Esther used beauty to influence the king, but this week I wanted to explore how Esther influenced the king through hospitality. This is the reason why it took me so long to get this video out. If I'm honest with you, I'm not really naturally inclined towards hospitality, hosting, throwing parties, even, certain aspects of domesticity are really intimidating to me. My family mostly celebrated intellect, faith, moral principle, and was less celebratory over things like domesticity, hospitality, or femininity. Definitely, this has been a journey, even just with my physical appearance, and now it is going to be a journey with my ability to be hospitable and to be a good hostess and to understand what the real meaning is behind that. But something interesting happened to me yesterday, and I was watching YouTube, as you do, and I came across Bindi Mark, I believe that's how you say her name. I came across Bindi Mark's video on meal prep, and it couldn't have been more timely. I was really struggling with this idea of me being the person who's going to be responsible for meals or parties or hosting. But Bindi Mark said something that I thought was really, really encouraging, and that is, she said, just pray that God would give you wisdom to prepare good meals, that he would bless your hands. And it reminded me instantly of my first video on divine feminine strategy, where I talked about how Esther prayed and fasted for 3 days. I'm sure during those 3 days of prayer and fasting, Esther must have gotten wisdom on what to prepare and how to prepare these 2 meals that she offers the king and Haman. And I suddenly realized I don't need to be afraid. Just like Esther, I just need to humble myself under the wisdom and instruction of the Most High. That's all. I don't need to worry or panic about what I don't know or how things might turn out. I just need to trust that God is going to give me the wisdom I need to make things happen. And that is exactly what Esther did. The amazing thing about how Esther used this gifting of hospitality is that she actually ended up killing 2 birds with 1 stone. Esther was somehow able, through these 2 dinners, to ingratiate herself with King Xerxes while also disarming her opponent, Haman. So in today's video, we will only be exploring how Esther's dinners may have affected the king. And in my next video, I will explore how Esther's dinners definitely did affect Haman. And without further ado, let's go ahead and read the scripture for today. Esther 5:4. And Esther said, "If it seems good to the king, let the king and Haman come this day to the dinner that I have prepared for the king." Then the king said, "Cause Haman to come quickly, that what Esther has said may be done." So the king and Haman came to the dinner that Esther had prepared. And during the serving of the wine, the king said to Esther, "What is your petition? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to the half of the kingdom it shall be performed." Then Esther said, "My petition and my request is, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and to perform my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the dinner that I shall prepare for them, and I will do tomorrow as the king has said." So the first thing that I want to point out is the very strangeness in the way that Esther made her request for the king to come to her dinners. It's a very strange way of answering the king, especially to us in the modern day. If someone asks you to say what you want, you just tell them, right? What's all this, if it pleases the king, if I found favor in his sight? What's all of that about? So I want to draw your attention to the fact that Esther really cannot be separated from this attitude of humility and submission. I mean, look at how she speaks to the king. If it seems good to the king, if I found favor in the sight of the king, if it pleases the king to grant my request, she should have just answered and said, please save me and my people. That's how I would have answered. But Esther, instead of asking for something, she offers something. Esther did not come to the king empty-handed. She came offering something. But it's not just the fact that she didn't come empty-handed, that she offered the king a meal. It's the way she offered this meal. She did not take for granted that her offer would be accepted. She again showed restraint, reverence, respect, not just because this was her husband, but because he was the king. If you look back at the way she spoke, she always mentioned not his name or that he was her husband. She constantly was referring to him as king. If it seems good to the king, let the king come. If I found favor in the sight of the king, if it pleases the king. This is showing us that Esther did not just see her husband as just her spouse or just this man she married. She didn't see him as merely just another man. She saw him as a king. And that is how she approached him. This is a man who oversees 127 provinces. Esther does not approach him as though he can clear his schedule at the drop of a hat because she showed up. She takes into account this man's office, his responsibilities. She doesn't think, oh, well, I've made a meal for you. I'm doing you a favor. No. Esther said, I'm going to, even in my offering, respect that it may not be accepted. It may not be convenient to him right now. If it pleases you, if I found favor with you, because I respect your station, I respect the responsibilities that you have that don't all pertain to me and what I want. Esther did not take for granted that her offer would be doing him a favor. She considered his willingness and availability to join her for these dinners. When Esther appeared before the Lord to ask him how to approach King Xerxes, I truly believe that God must have responded to her with the knowledge and revelation that God himself is a king, the King of Kings. So if Esther wanted to understand how to approach King Xerxes, she had to understand how she approached the King of Kings. If any king knows how a king wants to be approached, it's God. So here's a question for us. How do we approach the King of Kings? Sometimes we hear that scripture that tells us to come boldly before his throne, and we throw out our sense of respect. Should we just call upon him to grant whatever request we make without offering any sacrifice of praise? Should we just come rushing into the Lord's throne room, making demands without any reverence or consideration for his timing, his will, his sovereignty? Some of us even pray to God only making requests, and we never even stay long enough for him to speak to us because we never consider that maybe he also has something to say. Perhaps he has some thoughts. After all, he is God, isn't he? I mean, is God the King of Kings in our lives, or is he Santa Claus? Esther did not approach God as a Santa Claus. She came fasting. She came attentive. She came quiet, listening, ready to hear instruction. She came reverent. She came respectful to his throne room. Esther approached King Xerxes with a similar respect and reverence for his office, for the office that God had given him as king. Esther understood that this man, this king, was to be respected even by his beloved wife. So where in our lives do we sometimes take for granted our family members, our friends' time and efforts without any consideration that the time and energy they put into us, they are actually taking away from other responsibilities that they may have? Do we show reverence and concern and acknowledgement for the fact that they are not doing something for us without making a sacrifice in some other part of their life? We say, well, I'm doing them a favor. No, maybe this favor that you think you're doing for them is actually an inconvenience because of the timing or because of the situation or circumstance. Imagine a husband who has a very demanding boss, or who has a very complicated business that he's running, or a difficult business decision he has to make. He fights through traffic and gets home, and the first thing he gets when he arrives home is 10 demands from his wife and children. And when he protests, he's met with a response that makes him feel guilty and inadequate, rather than a response that acknowledges the efforts he's making, the responsibilities he has as head of household, as breadwinner, as businessman, or whatever it is that he contributes to society outside of his own home. There's no acknowledgement for his circumstance. So he feels unseen, and he feels unheard, and he feels neglected. So he shuts down and he shuts out his wife, his children. And what this wife may not realize is that she has missed an opportunity not to discourage or guilt her husband into doing something, but rather to inspire and influence her husband to reconsider things willingly, because he feels acknowledged, he feels seen, he feels heard. He knows you understand his burden, his plight. And that alone is energy giving, and that alone is revitalizing. And he's able to make the efforts he needs to, because at least he knows he's not alone. Someone understands, someone sees him. It is this situation that Esther so wisely avoided by acknowledging his headship, not only over her household, but over an empire. She respected his responsibilities, and she showed reverence for his royal office. Now, it was actually very difficult to get anything out of Esther's dinner. Why? Because there was nothing written about the dinner. There was nothing about how the dinner went. What did they talk about? Did she do anything special during these dinners? What was actually the dinner for? You know, okay, she made a dinner. What are we supposed to get from that? She made it twice. She made 2 dinners. And there's nothing that tells us what happened except for, well, after the serving of the wine, or during the serving of the wine, King Xerxes asked again, what's your request? That's all we get. There was wine. Okay. So I found it really difficult to really get an understanding or any kind of message from that, but I knew there had to be one in there. So I decided to do a little bit of outside research and look at how Persian royalty of those days might have prepared meals, might have thrown feast. I want to see how Esther may have coordinated her feast. So I actually ended up finding an article by the Smithsonian Magazine, which I think is a credible source because, as you know, the Smithsonian is a very well-known museum. The title of this article is, "What Was It Like to Dine with the Persian Kings?" Now, isn't that like the most perfect title for this video, and even probably for my very first video about King Xerxes. Let me just read a little bit from this article, and then we're going to kind of tie this in with Esther's dinners. As one of the earliest civilizations to start eating multi-course meals, Persians became renowned throughout the ancient world for their decadence and love of material wealth. Meals could sometimes last for days, with time set aside for drinking wine and listening to music after the dessert courses. During the feast itself, everyone ate in complete silence. No conversation. It's so contrary to our idea of eating. Kings would commission finely wrought gold and silver plates, wine horns, vases, and bowls that would either be used at feast or sent as gifts to other rulers. The abundance of gold and mines in the region, paired with the intricate craftsmanship, technically and artistically sophisticated even by modern standards, created a distinct reputation for Iranian royalty. The point was to broadcast wealth and power to the entire world. The ruler needs to project a certain image, not only to its people, but also beyond the borders. He makes the most lavish types of vessels, so when he invites people, he can take these out and everyone's astounded. It's seen as an extension of the king's identity. So there are three things that I really want to point out from this article. Number one is obvious. The Persian royalty loved to have lavish and artistic displays during their meals. Number two is that they ate their meals in silence. Number three is that this display during the meals was actually seen as an extension of the king's identity. From this article, I'm going to make the humble assumption that Esther prepared these two dinners in true Persian style, full of elaborate, artistic, beautiful decor. And when I pair this assumption with the fact that Persian meals were had in silence, it gives me a very interesting story. You see, if Esther's dinners were not about talking with the king, flattering the king, convincing the king, persuading the king, if she could not communicate verbally, if the purpose of these meals was not to talk with the king, what exactly was Esther trying to communicate by preparing these meals? We can't forget that Esther is a Jew. She did not grow up with Persian culture. She didn't grow up celebrating Persian holidays, and there is a whole history and culture that she grew up with that may have been in many ways very different and maybe even opposite of the Persian culture. So what was Esther trying to communicate through these meals? Perhaps she was trying to display to the king how much of his identity has now become hers, how deeply she understands his culture. Perhaps she was trying to re-establish a deep connection between him and her as husband and wife. Perhaps she was reminding the king that on the day they said "I do," she took on his identity. Perhaps Esther was demonstrating her oneness with him. I believe that it is God's intention that when we marry, we become one with our spouse. And the cause and concerns and interests of our spouse soon becomes our concern, cause, and interest as well. Was Esther communicating once again without words that she and the king were one, and she has now taken on his life as hers, his culture as hers, his interest as hers? And why would this particular message be so important to convey? I believe it is because Esther is about to ask for her life, for the life of her people. But you see, Esther's people are his people. Esther's life is his own life. What man would not protect himself? Ephesians 5:28 through 31. Even so, husbands should love their wives as being, in a sense, their own bodies. He who loves his own wife loves himself. For no man ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and carefully protects and cherishes it, as Christ does the church, because we are members, parts of his body. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and his mother, and shall be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. You see, the purpose of Esther's act of hospitality, at least towards her husband, was to fortify understanding, connection, and common ground. So much so that upon revelation that she would be in danger, he would not hesitate to take swift action. So the question I will leave us with today is this: are you seeing your hospitality as an opportunity to establish connection, common ground, or to convey and communicate understanding? So that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for joining me here on Lily of the Field. Next week, I will look at these same two dinners, but how they affected Haman in contrast. So I hope you join me there. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up. Comment if you have any insights of your own or disputes. And until next time, God bless. Bye.